Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks. Thank you for joining us once again for a stroll across the great battlefields of Europe. It's been fantastic. Thank you for joining us because we've loved doing it and we've seen the download numbers double in recent weeks. So it's just fantastic, the number of people that are getting on board. I think when we started doing this, there was a fair requirement to give us something to do to fill the time in during COVID, but it's great that so many people have come on board. And so BattleWalks is certainly going to continue long into the future. I should introduce, obviously, like always, my colleague who will be joining me on these walks across the battlefields. It's Pete Smith. Pete, great to have you back again.
Yeah, hi Matt, nice to be with you again.
Mate, this one we're doing this week, pretty close to our hearts, I think. Hill 60 in Belgium, in the Ypres Salient. And, I mean, this is just one of the essential sites. It seems that I say this every time we talk about the Western Front, that it's an essential site. It's a reflection of the range of important sites that are there on the battlefield. But there's a few sites you go to that just really connect you with the history, that bring the story alive, that are just absolutely iconic. And Hill 60 certainly has to be at the top of that list.
For me, it's a must go to site. And very oddly, I haven't been to it for over a year because of COVID. I can't travel across the border into Belgium and go and have a look around the site. So, 30 years I've been there multiple times every year, and for over a year and not been there. So I'm missing it greatly. But it's a fantastic site, and anybody that is going to explore the battlefields, especially the battlefields around Ypres and Belgium, then you've got to go.
It's not a particularly big site, but it's very big in terms of the history of what went on there, and also the history after the war, because this was a site that was preserved from pretty much the moment the guns fell silent. There's just some wonderful not wonderful, just some emotive and terrifying, in many cases, stories about what went on from both sides. The scene of mining, terrible trench fighting, just so much went on in such a compact area.
I mean, there is the horror that's obviously disconnected with the Great War in all of its forms, but I think there is something to take from it, and that's partly due to us, to the people that go and visit it, and the stories associated with the visitors. And of course, people have been visiting the site since the 1920s, and that will be part of this story, is that it has been a site that was preserved very early, and so really the first visitors were the relatives of those killed in the area and the men themselves returning. So it's a very important site for them and for the overall history of the Great War and onwards to modern times.
Well, let's put it in context. Tell us where exactly Hill 60 is, why it's called Hill 60, and why it was important to the history of the Great War.
Well, I've just mentioned the town itself. Back to that difficulty, Ypres, Ypres, other variations of it. It's just on the ridges, just outside of the town. So it's part of the fighting that started right at the beginning of the war as the British troops become involved. I think at this stage it is just British troops trying to keep the Germans away from the town of Ypres and fighting on those ridges around the outsides of the town. So it is on the ridges. It's actually, I have to just think of direction, it's to the slightly east, so it's southeast of the town if you're looking at a map, and a very important and key point, as will become obvious as we start talking.
And why do we call it Hill 60?
Good point. 4 years, in my early formative years as I'm starting to study the Great War, I was aware of Hill 60, I was aware of Hill 63, I was aware of Hill 62, all roughly in the same area. So it just stood to reason that there was a Hill 1 somewhere, and by the time we got to this point, we were up to Hill 60, and of course that's not the case at all. It is in fact height. And in this case, it's rather odd because it's metres above sea level, so it's 60 metres above sea level. Now, why I stress that point is because we are in imperial at this period. Our measurement is not metric, it's imperial, so why isn't it 60 feet? Because it certainly was. If we leap across to the Gallipoli Peninsula, there is a Hill 60 on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and that is 60 feet above sea level. So why are we in metres? Well, it's as simple as this. The maps and everything that we are going to inherit from the French and the Belgians and use for our calculations were all in metres, and it felt easier just to leave them in metres. So we actually used metres for heights during the First World War. So 60 metres high, Hill 60.
And I don't think we can stress enough that on the relatively flat plain of Belgian Flanders, a 60-metre hill is going to give you a great advantage in terms of your ability to watch what your enemy is doing.
Oh, it's an extraordinary, ridiculous as it may seem, it's an extraordinarily high hill, especially once you'd lost all the trees and the houses and everything, which the shelling will do. Then the viewpoint from Hill 60 is fantastic. The other thing I should stress is it's not a natural hill as well. It actually was a ridge, but it had been enhanced because there's a railway cutting going right along the side of it, and the spoil from the railway cutting, built in the 1850s, I think it was, then they threw out the spoil as they cut through the ridge onto the hill itself, and so formed a little bit of a higher hill than those around it. So Hill 60 is not totally natural, it's partly from this railway cutting.
And from the time the fighting arrived here in the salient, the hill was a natural defensive position. It was a natural target for both sides just because of those advantages of observation. So when was the first fighting here at Hill 60?
Yeah, well, it goes right the way to the beginning of the war as the Germans arrived here in the September. Then that's when the fighting will start, and it's the French that actually hold it originally. The French fight very hard to try and keep hold of it, but by the time they hand it over to the British troops, then they're actually no longer on it. And there is some debate about whether the French lost it or just slowly slid down the ridge, because as they handed it over, they actually said it was still under their control, but what became very obvious, it wasn't. It had been lost. So it's right the way from the British appearing in the salient, holding on to those ridges, stopping the German advance right in 1914, and that's where it starts.
The fighting continued throughout the war, and one of the key elements of the fighting here was mining. And we've touched on mining at a few sites before when we've walked around the Somme and Vimy Ridge. We talked about mining, and basically when we say mining, it's nothing to do with landmines. What we're talking about is tunnelers digging beneath the enemy lines and planting huge explosive charges and leaving these enormous craters. But this is probably one of the best sites on the Western Front to just understand how the landscape was torn apart by mining during the Great War.
It truly is. It's one of those things that's difficult to envisage, no matter how many times you visit the First World War. And I have to say, I'll just use an example. I once took a film crew round that said, "Pete, can you take us to a wood that looks like a wood of the First World War?" Well, that's not possible, because a wood of the First World War is no longer a wood. It is blown to smithereens. There's no ducking and diving through trees. The trees have gone. There's just stumps if you're lucky, and then those may have been turned over as well. So it's a landscape that's very hard to comprehend. And then if you add in this underground mining, not just the shelling and the detonation of mines beneath the troops, then it defies description, really. And it's quite something that's quite difficult to put across to people when, even though you're looking at a landscape that is still rippling, as this landscape is, but it's still difficult to imagine it without any grass, without any vegetation, without any trees, because there are a lot of trees growing on the site now.
And that's the key element of Hill 60 and why we visit it and why it's so important, is because the landscape's been preserved. Let's talk a little bit about what happened immediately after the war and how we ended up with this wonderful site that really tells a story by the nature of the torn up landscape.
Well, it's an interesting story, and I think it's a story that really could do with telling properly, and I don't think I've ever seen a book or read an article about the total story of how it came about. It's now owned by the Commonwealth War Graves, so the Commonwealth War Graves, as it was the Imperial War Graves, look after it. But you have to think about, how did that come about? And interestingly, it was actually purchased. So immediately after the war, a gentleman, I'm going to cover him in a second, the gentleman decided that he wanted to preserve a little bit of the landscape. Well, the first thing you have to think of, why did he pick Hill 60? Well, I think it's because Hill 60 resonated with everybody. It was known by everybody. It was known by the families at home. It was known by the soldiers. And I think because it filled people with such horror. If you were going into the sector that included Hill 60, you knew you were in for a rough time. So it was a location that was very, very well known back in Britain and around the Empire. You would have to say Hill 60 was known by everybody. So I think that's partly the reason why it's going to be purchased by this gentleman. But I think there's more to it than that. I think it's because the landscape had been so devastated that you would have to say the farmer and the owner of the land prior to the war must have thought, how on earth am I going to get this back into any condition where I can use it for anything that's sensible? And so when Lieutenant Colonel Corsten approached the landowners, he was able to buy it for 15,000 Belgian francs, which I don't know what the translation is. To me, it sounds quite a lot of money for not a great area of land that is completely devastated and was going to be very difficult to do anything with. But obviously he is buying it for another reason. He is buying it because he believes that this needs to be preserved. He had fought there and he had been actually wounded there, so it was a landscape that he was aware of. But then you have to ask yourself, why was he buying it? Why? Yes, he might think it has to be preserved, but that's a lot of money just to lose. I don't believe he was ever that wealthy, and in fact will lose his wealth later on. So why would you spend so much money? Yes, there's going to be an element of he will make money out of it. Now, it may only be that he will make money out of it to get his money back, the expenditure that he spent. But don't think that this site was just a site that was just open and you could just wander about. It was always going to be enclosed, which it was, and you paid your fee to go on there because there were people who were looking after the site. They were making sure it didn't deteriorate. So it was a site where you paid your money. And oddly, for those that have listened to the podcast previously, you'll know that I'm a little bit of a collector, and I have a ticket stub for a franc or whatever it was. I can't remember off the top of my head, but whatever it was, then it's the stub that was given to you as you approached and went onto the site. And the site had various relics that had been left around. The trenches were fairly well preserved. There had been even oddities added to improve, I suppose, the view across the battlefield or the old battlefields. So there was a scaffolding tower that you could climb up and go on top of that and take your photographs looking across the battlefield. And hundreds of thousands of people did, you would have to say, over the 10 years or more that it was open. It actually closed in the 1930. But up until that point, then tens of thousands of people would have visited it on a little fragment of the battlefield that was going to remain a fragment of the battlefield. And so that's the key. And that's why we go today, is because it is still a fragment of the battlefield where we can walk across it on the landscape that the soldiers walked on. And that's why it's so emotive to so many people, is that you're walking on a landscape that really, yes, it's changed, yes, it's softened, yes, the trees have grown and the grasses have grown, but you are still walking on a tiny fragment of the First World War battlefield.
It's really quite beautiful as well. If you're there in spring, there's blossoms in the trees and flowers are out. It's, again, the great contradiction about the battlefields of the Great War is that it's actually beautiful countryside. It's a lovely place to be. And yet you stand on Hill 60 in amongst the trenches and the pillboxes and the mine craters, and just you don't have to think very hard to realise the horror of what went on around there. And in fact, how many men are still buried, still lie beneath that hill? It's really quite shocking to comprehend.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the things I was just going to say myself, Matt, is they are still here as well. One of the reasons why the Commonwealth War graves, they were actually given it was given to Britain and then handed over by the British government to the Commonwealth War graves almost immediately for them to do something with. But it's one of the things that becomes fairly obvious when you walk around the site, is that if this site is still rippling and still as it was trenched and cratered, then nobody has actually ploughed it or dug it or built anything on it. And of course, that is what in other areas around the salient has brought the bodies to light throughout right to modern times. So if that hasn't happened, then the bodies that weren't recovered easily, that weren't easy to spot, then they are still there. And of course, beneath, really deep, 30 metres beneath the landscape, then we have that tunnel fighting that went on, and they're here as well. So you have, sadly, layers of bodies beneath you, or the potential of layers of bodies. Of course, there would have been a search of these areas. People didn't just kind of abandon them. These areas were searched for bodies, but that's only really looking for human remains on the surface, or any signs that human remains may be below the surface. And as we know from the number of missing of the Great War, then it's not always particularly successful.
So I'd say it's a rewarding and a confronting site at the same time. And this reiterates what we said at the start, that it's an essential site to visit. Well, you visited a lot, Pete, so let's do a walk around the site and just share your experiences of walking Hill 60.
Well, I think one of the interesting things is it's changed from the early days when there were no duckboards, and we're going to enter the site onto a duckboard tracking. At one time, it was just purely muddy trackways, and that was the problem. They were getting muddier and muddier, and as more and more people started visiting the site, and certainly since the film Beneath Hill 60, which came out probably about 8 or 9 years ago now, that also drew more and more people, and certainly it drew an awful lot of Australians, because it's about an Australian tunnelling company, and so we get more and more people coming, and those numbers have increased in the last 20 odd years. And so the walkways around the site, which you could wander wherever you wanted, were difficult at various times of the year, especially if it had been raining a lot. So the Commonwealth War Graves decided that they needed to do something about it, and it was in 2015 they started bringing in fairly heavy plant and mechanical equipment to actually start putting in a raised walkway that was going to zigzag all over the site. And for a change, and it's very unusual for the Commonwealth War Graves, they didn't get it right, and there was a big outcry from people who were saying you cannot bring this mechanical equipment onto the site. There are the remains of soldiers beneath here. and it's ruining the site. It's flattening some of the trenches and the shell holes. And so the work was stopped, and they changed tack completely and decided to reduce the number of walkways that were going to go onto the site to just one that snakes from one side to the other, and also do most of the work by hand. So it improved dramatically. I have to say, I wasn't always quite so happy about it. I thought it would change the site and make it feel odd. But having now used this duckboarding that we're going to enter when the conditions are really bad, you realise it is very helpful, and it gives you a little bit better view as well when you're walking across. So there's a lot to be gained by the duckboarding now. So we're going to enter the site by a new car park, also created at the same time. And the first thing that we're going to actually see is a memorial. So there are memorials within the site itself, and this is to the Queen Victoria's Rifles. And for those who haven't ever seen a photo of it, it is an odd-looking memorial. There are kind of bits sticking out here and bits sticking out there. It's squat. It's not attractive in any means. And it looks strange. And why it looks strange is because this is not the original memorial, because the fighting, very sadly, will return here in 1940, and this memorial is going to be damaged in the fighting of 1940 and not rebuilt as it had been. It had been a rather large pinnacle, an obelisk, with a stairway going up from the old entrance, the stairway walking up to it, so with organised flower beds and plantings. So it was a bit more formal than it is now, the whole site. And you have to ask, why didn't they rebuild it at the end of the Second World War? Why did not they rebuild it as it had been? And I don't know exactly, but I think I can guess. And it's because it was felt not the right thing to do. It was felt that the fighting had come back here yet again. It was such a horrific thought that the area had been fought over again, that it was decided just to rebuild it from the fragments that were left, put a new explanatory panel on it, and not make a big deal of it, really. And so we have this very subdued memorial now, commemorating the Queen Victoria's Rifles. It's a London Territorial, a part-time regiment based in London, commemorating their service and the fighting here. And in fact, as I said, Lieutenant Colonel Corsten, he was actually with that battalion when they fought on Hill 60. So it tells you something straight away, that something went on here, and we're going to be talking about that as we walk around the site during the Second World War as well. And that's almost too horrific to contemplate. A site that was so horrific in the First World War will be fought over again in the May of 1940 during the fall back towards Dunkirk. So we're going to continue along that duckboarding, beautiful duckboarding, anti-slip, so you're not going to fall off it. It is a little odd for our modern minds, certainly those of us who are perhaps involved in health and safety, because there's no handrail and it is slightly raised. So I always advise my clients to try and not step off it, because it could be embarrassing. But eventually we are going to walk off the duckboarding, because you need to get off it every now and then to actually put your feet on the ground.
Pete, the thing that always strikes me when I visit Hill 60 is it's not just a preserved landscape with trenches and the occasional shell hole, as you see in other parts of the Western Front. It demonstrates the ferocity and the technology that was employed during the fighting, because it's also covered in lumps of concrete, pillboxes. You can just see the ferocity of the fighting that went on, the systems that were employed to defend and to attack. It's really there is a lot to see on Hill 60, isn't there? It's a little bit unexpected.
Well, I'm going to do my famous concrete talk now. It is interesting in that just on the one site, we can see how concrete changes from frontline concrete to just behind the lines concrete. Because the first thing, as we step off the duckboarding, we're going to be looking at a very low, almost disappearing in the ground. The soil has nearly covered it over, but it's a frontline German blockhouse. Now, I'm going to use lots of different terms. Pillbox, blockhouse, what is the difference? Well, there isn't. It's just words that we used at various times. My kind of attitude is I use blockhouse for something that's not got a firing aperture, and I use pillbox for something that has got a firing aperture. But this one hasn't, so I think we'll stick to blockhouse. And it is literally a block of concrete that's hollow in the middle with a door at the back. And that's always the clue as to who built it, because the door is always facing your own lines. The door will never face your enemy. So the door here is facing back towards the German lines, not looking out of the view across the salient and to Ypres. So it's German built. It's capable of taking 2 or 3 men at the most, and It is alongside another one that has lost its roof, but is beside it. So you can see there were 2 or 3 all together here. And basically what they're for is they're for machine gunners. Machine gunners who will shelter in there. They're not going to fire. There's no firing aperture. When the time is right, they're going to come out with their machine gun, their Maxim gun, and they're going to set it up and open fire. So it's a shelter for gunners, frontline machine gunners. The concrete is terrible. It's if you were involved in quality control of the mixing of concrete, then you would look at this and think, oh my goodness, this is just appalling. They've thrown in everything. But then you have to think about where it was. It's in the front line. It's right on the top of the crest. So it would be behind a pile of sandbags. And this is half a dozen Germans with buckets and spades and cement and basically throwing in anything that they can find to make a concrete and then pouring it in a framework. So there is a form in there. In other words, it's formed and it has steel inside, but the mixing of the concrete. So this is concrete mixing under duress. You would have to be ducking and diving in the dark quietly trying to pour this concrete to build this position. So it's not good concrete, and it's well worth pointing out because on other sites around the Great War, and in fact on this site, you can see some very well poured concrete, but this is not it. This is frontline concrete. So it's interesting just from that one point of view. But then you have a look at the door at the back and you realise that even if this wasn't so full of soil and dug out, this is a tiny door. Well, it's a tiny door because the smaller the door, then the less chance of jagged steel getting inside there and pinging about and killing everybody. So you need to have a small door. It's a kneeler door. You'd have gone in on your knees, basically, dragging your gun with you, and then possibly a steel plate inside, a couple of sandbags. You'd put those inside, and while the heavy shelling was going on, you'd be in there. And then when you start thinking about it, it just makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand out as to what it would have been like inside that position during a bombardment.
Just horrific. I always say when I lead a tour that I'm a bit of a pillbox nerd because they're just such tangible connections with the fighting that went on. Pillboxes, basically, concrete protective structures are only built because people needed protection. So they were never built, 100 kilometres behind the lines. They were built either right in the front line where there was shelling taking place all the time, or slightly in the rear area where there were still shells falling all around and where people needed protection. And they're impossible to move. There's still massive concrete pillboxes all over the Western Front. So every time you go there, you know that there was a lot of heavy fighting in that area and that a lot of people died in the vicinity of where you are.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. And that will become obvious as we start walking along the track. So now we're off the duck boarding and we're going to be walking along the track. And again, it weathers out. There's no lawn on the tracked area. And I can't help it. I'm an obsessive battlefield field walker, so I always just keep my eyes on the floor as I'm walking, normally with my clients. And a number of times I've just bent down and picked up a button or something of interest that you can just find there. And that's the clue. If you can find buttons and fragments of equipment, then sadly the men are going to be there as well. And I haven't ever found human remains there, but I know people who have. So it really brings it home to you, these little pieces of metal that you can pick up, these little pieces of brass as you're walking. Around us as we're walking through the site, now we have a lot of trees. There are cherry trees, there are all sorts of trees, because this is a little bit of a nature site as well. It's looked after now with a view that animals will live here, and so we have a lot of trees that will help animals. And this enormous cherry tree on our left-hand side now got a fence around it, so you can't get underneath it. And the reason for that is that it lost a few big branches in recent years, and I think they don't want anybody else to be killed on Hill 60, so they keep you away from that one. But the other trees are you can walk up to them and touch them, and it's just nice to get that feel of nature, remembering that everything that's growing there, even though this is a big old tree, everything that's growing on the site is post the First World War. There's nothing pre, because everything was totally obliterated here. So we're going to walk back over the back of the ridge, so we've got an element of safety now. If you're a frontline soldier, you're still not in view of your enemy as you're working your way to the front line. And we're going to walk up to another very big German blockhouse. Now, this is nothing like the one we've just been talking about. This is a big one. This would take at least a dozen people if you squished them in there, and they did at the time when they needed to. And it's got firing apertures, which is fairly unusual to see a big concrete blockhouse with firing apertures. It's fascinating. We'll talk about the apertures, but what I always find fascinating is this must be the most photographed blockhouse on the Western Front. And it has been since the 1920s, because it was always preserved, it was always there. And people came here and had their photographs taken. Now, I've got a little photograph archive, a photographic archive. And within those photographs, I've got a picture of a group of veterans in the 1920s, possibly 1930s, standing around here, trilby hats on, gabardine macs, sandwich boxes in one hand, and you can see a bottle of brown, a bottle of beer sticking out the other pocket. And they're laughing and smiling and standing around this blockhouse. And I just think it's a wonderful photograph because it's really about guys that survived the war and were able to come back and actually talk about it, which would have helped them immeasurably. And they're just standing arm in arm. Some of them have their arms linked. And you can tell they're on an organised pilgrimage back to the First World War.
Pete, when I take people around the battlefields, I always, again, as being a pillbox nerd, I always point out the differences between British and German pillboxes and say this one's you can tell the concrete tends to be darker on a German pillbox. And as you said, the direction it's facing is the best indicator of what it was. But I always play a bit of a trick on them when I come to this one because I say, okay, you've had enough time now to learn all about pillboxes. Is this one a German or a British pillbox? And there's a spirited argument between the people on the tour. And in the end, I say, I'm sorry, I've tricked you. It's actually both because this pillbox was what they called turned around, wasn't it? Just tell us the fascinating story of the life of this pillbox and how it came to look as it does now.
Well, it's always a term that, we used. This one was reversed or turned around. And I can see people kind of looking at me. And I said, no, I don't mean literally. They didn't move it around. You cannot move a pillbox around. What they did was basically they altered it. So in this case, what they did was they literally cut through firing apertures. So this is after it was captured during the Battle of Messines. And it's in fact, it's going to be Australian engineers which will work on quite a bit of the changes to this pillbox. So they're going to cut through apertures. We have 2 firing apertures, thin slits. Those slits look rather wide at the moment, and that's because the timber work that went around the entrances that would have taken the impact of bullets being fired at them, ricochets, well, it's to stop ricochets from going within the pillbox. So they look like quite wide apertures, but with the timber work, then they would have been originally a lot smaller than that. You can see the thickness of the concrete, and that is always absolutely shocking if you haven't realised how thick the concrete is in a pillbox. 3 feet at least thick. Sorry, I'm using the old money again. 3 foot of concrete, so just enormously solid construction. So to cut these apertures had not been easy. To reverse this, to make it into our firing position so that we could stop the Germans if ever they come back, and come back they will in the spring of 1918. And sadly, it was overrun again. This pillbox was taken in 1918. It's very obviously damaged. We can see the damage all around the apertures. And so again, what most people think is that this was damage from the fighting in 1918 when the Germans retook it. But in fact, it's not. It was refronted during the Second World War when we used it again. So it's refronted, so it was tidied up. It had been damaged, but by the time that the Germans are going to return here in 1940, this was quite a smart-looking position again, and it's going to be used again. And the damage that we can see all around it is from the fighting that took place here in 1940. In fact, it's fascinating that when you look careful at it, there is actually a 3.7 centimetre anti-tank round embedded in the concrete. So you can see it. I saw it for years without realising what it was, until one day I was looking at the damage all around it and realised that these were shots from an anti-tank gun. It's an anti-tank gun, a German light anti-tank gun that was brought up to take out this pillbox to a very close. And once you can see the angle of these rounds as they're hitting the concrete and either embedding themselves in the concrete or ricocheting off, you can see exactly where the gun must have been firing from. And A Company of the 2nd Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers, they almost fought themselves out of existence here, giving them more time to evacuate, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, more time to evacuate to the beaches of Dunkirk. So there was fairly tough fighting up on Hill 60 at this time in the May of 1940, which I think is just extraordinary. So now let's go back to those smiling, happy faces of the veterans of the 1930s. Who would have had, I just can't imagine what it must have felt like to them to know, because we did know it was in the newspapers, that the fighting had returned, that the fighting returned to all of their battlefields of the First World War. And I just find that totally depressing of how they must have felt, thinking that they had fought the war to end all wars, and yet the fighting is going to return to, and it's the same old enemy, to the battlefields that they had fought during 1418.
It's very well said, Pete, and I can't begin to imagine the horror of the British troops defending that pillbox in 1940 as the Germans rolled up an anti-tank gun and just started blasting away. at the apertures. It's just... I mean, I know it's what the Germans went through in the First World War. It's a nature of warfare. But I think it's important that we stand there and see that damage, and you can see the individual shots from that gun, and it just paints a picture for you of what it must have been like. I remember when I was in, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but when I was in Russia and Eastern Europe, back in my backpacking days, I went to a small island off Estonia where there'd been a lot of fighting, both when the Germans rolled through in 1941 and then, of course, when they were kicked back by the Russians in 1944. And there were a number of pillboxes where you could just see damage to the apertures on the front, but then a huge amount of small arms fire damage inside the pillbox. And it just demonstrated that once these pillboxes had been overrun, someone just shoved a submachine gun in the back of the door and just sprayed the inside. And just, I can never get my head around it. That's probably part of my connection with pillboxes. It's just the nature of that type of fighting. So claustrophobic, so horrific. Just absolutely awful. It's why it's always important that we stop and inspect these pillboxes and just think about what went on around them.
I think it's confronting. No matter how much talking you do when you're in an open landscape and you're just talking about a battle in an open landscape, when you've got this tangible evidence of physical fighting, then it is confronting because it makes you think a little bit more deeply about what it would have been like to be facing something, whatever it is, however horrific, to face it and then to actually touch that tangible evidence of that battle. That's something taking place. Yeah, amazing. It is, and that's why this is such a great site, is because there is so much to see. And I should say that we're going to just talk about these two pillboxes. We won't talk about any more. But there are others scattered all over. You walk over some, you see the fragments of others, and you realise that the Germans had seriously fortified Hill 60 with an awful lot of concrete in the periods when they held it, which I have to say, for most of the war, they are holding Hill 60.
If we're talking claustrophobia and the horror of close confines fighting and being cut off from the open ground, there's probably only one thing that's worse than the pillbox fighting, and that is the mine fighting, the tunnelers, the engineers planting explosives meters, tens of meters beneath the enemy. Let's talk about mining. We've touched on it on other podcasts. This is probably the best spot to know about it, and there is a very famous mine crater here, the Hill 60 mine crater.
It is, and that's where we're heading now. We're going to the pillbox that we've just been discussing is on our right-hand side. We're going to follow the windy track through the trees. This is where it always gets a bit boggy, gives you that bit more of a realistic feeling in the winter. Up onto the crest of the crater, and we're going to be looking down into the Hill 60 mine crater. Now, I have had people who are expecting it to be something else, something much more, I suppose, defined. This is not a defined crater particularly because it's going to be fought over again. It's also the nature of the clay. It doesn't leave a defined blast radius that you can see very clearly as you can on the Somme battlefield. We're not far away from one that is very visible on the Somme. This one is one that's going to be fought over after this detonation, shell holes all within it, soil pouring back into it, so it's not a massively defined one. It also has another issue. There's about a third of it missing because that railway cutting that I mentioned earlier that causes the height to be the Hill 60 aspect, then that was half filled in again because of this detonation, and that's going to be it's going to be cut through again. So all the spoil that fell into that railway cutting doesn't form a lip. So we've got basically a third of it is missing, a third of the lip is missing of the crater. So it's not quite as spectacular as people imagine, and yet to my mind it is, because it is left exactly as it was. So we're going to walk down to the centre of the crater. And as I say, this is the famous mine crater. That film, Beneath Hill 60, if you haven't seen it, then I would try and find it, because it's a very good film in giving you a feel. Not always historically correct. It has that bit of those brave Australians led by those nasty English officers, which is something in Australian films you get quite often. But it's a really good depiction of what it was like to be a tunneler during the First World War. So let's, as Matt suggested, we'll talk a little bit about the tunnelling, because the tunnelling is so different in different areas of the battlefield. So where I live on the Somme, it's chalk, it's dry, you can tunnel fairly easily, but you can be heard because chalk resonates. Where we are now, it's clay, it's difficult to remove, it's boggy, it's cold. Removing it is difficult because it comes off in kind of in sticky lumps, and so you have to have people who are used to digging clay in sticky lumps, and they tend to be known as clay kickers. And they were people that basically you sit down on a cruciform T-shape and it supports your back, and then you can lift your feet up onto your spade, which has a cross piece on it, push into the clay, twist, and you pull out a plug of clay. You hand it to the chap behind you who puts it in a sandbag until he's got enough in that sandbag, and then he passes it back, and you've got a chain that will remove it off the face of where you're digging. So what are the issues? Well, the issues are it's damp, it's clay moves, so you basically have to revet the whole thing. In other words, you have to basically box it in. As you're tunneling, you are boxing in. The exact opposite of the tunneling on the Somme. With it being chalk, you didn't have to box it in at all. It's self-supporting. You can just carry on digging. Here, every single metre has to be boxed in with timber. So amounts of timber being used enormous. It's totally silent. So the Germans who are tunnelling as well, they could almost slide past each other without knowing that they were there. And it gets so close that it's only when the walls start to wobble that you know there's something on the other side of it. And that's ridiculous when you think that on the Somme, the sound travelling through the chalk travels faster than it travels through air. So you could hear somebody immediately they started tunnelling, whereas here on the Salient, in this clay, you couldn't. There's also other issues, and that's you've got layers of sand here, and sand obviously moves and is very difficult to tunnel through. Different types of clay, blue clay, which is a little lower. So the guys that are doing this tunnelling, they're not just Joe Bloggs being sent down. Give them a spade. You can do some tunnelling today. These are mining engineers from all over the empire, and that means South Africa, Canada, Australia, Britain, tin miners, coal miners, gold miners. Every type of miners you can think of, and they are going to be employed doing their job that they were doing, but obviously under very trying and difficult circumstances.
Let's talk about the Battle of Messines a little bit, Pete, where these tunnels were dug, because the story of the mines, I mean, we'll do separate walks around the Messines battlefield, but the story of the mines here is particularly relevant. And just give us an indication of how deep these mines were, how much the explosives were. Let's talk a few facts and figures to describe how effectively half the hill has been blown away by this massive mine crater.
Okay, so this wasn't just one mine. That's the first thing to say. What we're looking at now, or standing in the crater of, is the last mine of 19 mines during the Battle of Messines. Now, the Battle of Messines, 7th to the 10th of June for Australians. It's one of the most successful actions of the Great War, you have to say. 19 mines blowing successfully. 2 did not go, but 19 of them did. This is the last one. And they blew... they were supposed to all blow at exactly the same time, and that was 3:10 on the 7th of June, so 3:10 in the morning, and it was a shock to the Germans. The Germans had no idea that this mine was going to go off, because we dug the tunnels almost a year before. In fact, the Australians had not dug this tunnel. This is the Hill 60 mine. It had actually been done by the Canadians, who had created the void, packed in the explosives. So how much explosives are we using here? Well, it's 53,300 pounds of ammonol that's going to be packed in here. Well, you start thinking, what is that like? What does that look like? Well, it's an enormous, damn great room full of explosives. So you've got to dig out this large area, make sure that the explosives are protected from water, because remember, this is waterlogged. That's the other thing I should have added. If you're digging here, then really you have to pump 24/7. So for well over a year, this has been pumped. So this is why those men always in these, even though it was completed a year before, men have needed to keep on top of it all the time to make sure the clay is not moving, that the water is removed, and that the powder and ammonol that is down there is kept dry, ready for when it's going to be needed. And this is going to be the Battle of Messines. So all of these 19 mines, roughly the same size, they're not all the same size, but roughly the same size, are going to be detonated in the morning on the 7th of June at 3:10. And there is a rippling effect that will take place, because everybody was twitchy. You can imagine everybody's nervous about making sure they get it right. Synchronisation of watches, not brilliant. And so it's going to start on the right, looking at it from a British perspective, near Plug Street Wood. And as I say, we will almost certainly do a podcast about the fighting around that area later on. And then the 19 mines coming like giant footsteps, I often describe it, towards this final one. And I think that's one of the more horrific aspects, really. If you were a German here and you knew what was coming, because you would have done, you could hear this giant's footsteps as each mine went off. And that's because everybody's a little nervous. What they're doing is they're waiting for the mine to blow on their right. And so you get this footstep effect, which must have been truly terrifying for the guys that were in this last one, the German soldiers cowering in those concrete bunkers thinking, is this underneath me? Am I going to get caught by this blast? And off it went. The spoil was blown out, and as I mentioned earlier, some of it was blown back in later on. But it's left this enormous hole. So let's do the dimensions of the hole. So it's 60 feet or 80 metres, depending on which you want to use, deep, and it's 260 feet or 79 metres wide. So it's a fairly big old hole in the ground. And if you added together all of the 19 detonations and tot it up, at that time, it is the largest man-made, if you put them together, largest man-made explosion that had taken place. Interestingly, it's not going to last very long, because not long after this, in Halifax in Nova Scotia, an American ammunition ship blew up in the harbour there, and that will become the biggest bomb until we get the atomic blasts of the Second World War. That will be the biggest explosion. It flattened Halifax in Nova Scotia. But up until that point, this was one of the largest detonations. Now, there's all sorts of stories about how loud and how enormous were these 19 detonations, and one of the most famous stories that people tell, including myself for years, was that it rattled the windows in the Houses of Parliament and the teacups in the Houses of Parliament, and it was minuted in their minute book. Well, interestingly, you would have felt it in Britain and certainly at the coast when these mines went off. But it's not the mines particularly, it is the artillery that opened up at the same time. It's one of the heaviest bombardments and a hurricane bombardment that took place at the same time as these detonations. And the combination of all of that is what would have been felt rather than heard. You would have heard it, but it's that feeling that you get in the stomach of, imagine when you can hear a thunderstorm a long way away. You can feel it sometimes long before you can actually hear it. Well, that's the kind of effect that it had in Britain. So it is an enormous blast and was a very, very successful attack.
Very well described, Pete. I mean, just, again, horrific elements. That's why we visit Hill 60, to bring these elements to life. But they're confronting. They're confronting. And standing in the Hill 60 crater, you can walk to the bottom of it, which is always good to get a perspective from the bottom. Just a fascinating and distressing aspect of fighting in the First World War. But we're going to keep walking through the crater now, Pete. And what are we going to head to next?
Well, we're climbing up the lip of the crater and back towards the duck boarding. And that's thankfully, one of the things that I was concerned about when they put the duck boarding in. There was talk at one time that you would be held onto the duck boarding, that you would only be allowed to now no longer roam across the site. And thankfully, that didn't come to pass, because, as I said earlier, one of the great aspects of this site is that we can go wherever we want. So very often I have to kind of gather the clients. I give them a little bit of time to wander about the crater and into the sides and have a look around. And we will gather ourselves again as we climb back onto the duck boarding, and we're going to walk down towards the road. Again, the road sweeps around one side of the site. This is where the car parking used to be. But as we walk along the duck boarding, I always like to point this out because it irritates me a little bit, but only because it's not explained properly. And there is a steel panel within the floorboards, the duck boarding, which says German front line and the date, and it's 1914. And then just up less than 20 paces away, you can see another steel plate a little bit higher up, and it says British or French front line in that winter of 1914-15. And of course, when you see the students of school students especially, they normally split into two halves, and one half stands on one panel and one half stands on the other panel, and they're shouting at each other and saying, look how close it is, the trenches were always this close, blah, blah, blah. And of course, what this is actually showing, it's showing the unusual that just for a very short period in that winter of 16-17, the trenches were very close together at this point. Would that be tenable? No, it wouldn't. Nobody would be able to hold those frontline positions easily, and in fact, in most cases, there was nobody in them, even though it's absolutely right. That is a frontline trench for the Germans, that is a frontline trench for the British or the French, and they are very close together. But all you need to do is to pick up a lump of rock. Now, I've seen a very good teacher, hand out potatoes to his students and get them to throw potatoes at each other from one side to the other. And what becomes apparent is if you had hand grenades, it is totally untenable. Now, in 1914, rudimentary hand grenades for ourselves, jam tin bombs, but the Germans had well-made hand grenades. So it's not tenable, and it becomes very obvious it's not tenable. But unless there's a sign that says that, then you can get the wrong idea by looking at sites like this where the trenches are very close together. So I always make sure that my clients are aware that this is really pointing out the unusual. So we carry on up on the duck boarding. We're walking behind the Australian commemoration of the tunnellers, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and we're going to walk towards a memorial to the 14th Light Division. So that's a British division, about 20,000 men. And I always spend quite a bit of time here because it's a great memorial. It survived the Second World War without being damaged to a greater extent. I think it's a bit patched up a little bit, but it's still complete. And on it lists all of the units within that division, including the fighting forces and all the support forces. Now, I'm not going to go through everything here, but it's a great ready reckoner for those people that have often wondered, what does a division, what is the makeup of a division? 20,000 men, what are they all doing? So you can actually run through this and say, these guys are the infantry, these are the support arms on the other side, including the engineers and the medics, and on we go. So it's an interesting memorial to actually have a look at and to discuss the makeup of a division. We'll perhaps save that for another podcast. And then we're going to walk towards the road, but just before we actually hit the road, on our left-hand side, oddly, we can see a French flag flying. And that catches out lots and lots of people. They see this French flag and they wonder, what is that all about? So as we walk towards the road, unusually on the left-hand side, we can see a French flag flying. So what have we got? A French flag here, remembering that we're in Belgium. Well, this flag is there along with a small memorial commemorating, again, the Second World War. And very sadly, it's where two resistance fighters, a chap called Pierre Merchant and Lucien Olivier, were murdered on the 2nd of September 1944. They'd been resistance fighters, captured in Lille with a lorry load of explosives. Not a good thing to be caught with, I suspect. And they were being transported on the train, presumably to be interrogated somewhere. We don't know exactly why. There are stories that they tried to escape. There are stories that the Germans have stopped the train and shot them. But whatever happened, the local people heard shots in the night. And in the morning, they found the bodies of these two young men beside the railway track. They buried them close by. And then their relatives after the Second World War came and removed them and took them home. So I think it's a really nice gesture of the Belgian local people. They decided that they wanted to have their deaths commemorated at this site, and so we have little pictures of them, little photographs embedded into a memorial. So I always take people across to go and have a look at that site. And we're going to walk that way, and we'll come back to the Australia Memorial. We're going to walk that way, and just very briefly, I don't spend too long here because we've already covered mine craters. But the Australian tunnelling companies here that detonated those mines during the Battle of Messines, wasn't just one, there was a second one. It's known as the Caterpillar. The Caterpillar is very different to the one we've just been talking about, the Hill 60 mine, because the Hill 60 mine is cratered and looks as it did, or as it would have done towards the end of the war. The Caterpillar looks very different. I don't know what you think about the Caterpillar, Matt.
Well, it's a fascinating one because it's a perfectly symmetrical crater, like incredibly symmetrical and full of water. And again, being a little bit silly, trying to lighten the mood a little bit with my groups, often I'll go up there and as we stand looking over it, I don't tell people where we're going. I just lead them through the woods to this crater. And when we get there, it's incredibly impressive. And I'll say something silly like, this was the Germans behind the lines built a swimming pool so that they could have some rest and relaxation. And most people don't believe me, but you get the occasional person who goes, oh, really? That's fascinating. I never would have known. But my point is you can get away with this because it looks so man-made. It's so symmetrical. It's full of water. It looks like a pond in an English country park. It's really quite extraordinary. And as you say, very, very different to the one only a few hundred metres away across the railway track at Hill 60.
It is. I sometimes don't go to the Caterpillar for that very reason. It always feels slightly false to me, and more so in recent years because the trees used to come right to the lip of the Caterpillar, so you were sort of kind of on the edge of a wood looking down. They've now cleared all the trees from the lip, so there are no trees around it, so it's now kind of open and looks even more formed, as if it's been formed deliberately. And it obviously was. What happened at the end of the war, the Caterpillar crater was landscaped. It's now part of a little parkland in this area, it feels odd. That's the only thing I'll say, really. But it's worthwhile going to have a look at, because for a lot of people, that's what they're expecting. They're expecting to see this big crater with water at the bottom. You get that with that. But it doesn't, to me, it's not part of the battlefield, which certainly Hill 60 is. It's that preserved landscape. So we're going to turn around and we'll walk back across the railway bridge. I'm not sure I mentioned that we'd crossed the railway bridge, and that's that railway that runs beside Hill 60. And walking to the Australian Memorial, and this is the First Australian Tunnelling Company Memorial. For many years, this was really the one of only a couple of memorials commemorating tunnellers on the Western Front, so it was always very well visited by people who knew anything about tunnelling on the Western Front. Now, we've already talked about it a little bit, but for many, many years, it was not really part of the Great War that people really talked about. There were very few books that you could buy to learn about what it was like to be a tunneller in the Great War. It was almost an overlooked fragment of the battlefield, and yet so many men involved. What I should have said earlier is that even infantrymen, just a straightforward infantryman in any kind of battalion, would take his turn at being in the tunnels, because somebody, that chain of men that had to pass the sandbags full of the spoil from the face of the tunnel, they took turns at going down into the tunnels to move spoil. And I often think that must have been, take your pick, don't you? Which you prefer? Do you prefer to be in a trench where you're in the open and potentially you could be killed by shell fire or snipers or whatever, or in a tunnel where you could potentially be killed by counter-tunnelling work when they blow something called a camouflage, which is an underground detonation designed to destroy tunnels and to kill tunnellers? So, and especially what if you're a bit claustrophobic? I'm not particularly, but I know lots of people are. And they suddenly said, right, guys, today we're going down this shaft, and these shafts are small. These are small shafts. So to give you an idea, if you put your hands together in front of you and point your elbows outwards, then that is about how wide they are, an awful lot of them, and you then have to squat slightly. So these are not big tunnels. I've been in quite a few over the years. I've been involved in helping out clear out tunnels at various sites around the Western Front, and they are small. The majority of these tunnels are very, very small. So, yeah, tunnelling was something that really needed a special kind of man. And the original tunnellers, as I said earlier, they were recruited from companies and for firms. And this is the case of the First Australian Tunnelling Company. It was originally a boring company of men that it was suggested that they might like to go to the Western Front and continue doing their job on the Western Front. Well, how do you entice somebody to come onto the Western Front when this is volunteers? These are Australians, they're volunteers, nobody can force you to go. And of course, it's money, adventure, all the rest of those things that brought people to the battlefields. But money helps. If you're going to be paid very well, then it helps immeasurably.
It's a fascinating memorial, Pete, and it's got the rising sun on it, and Australians gather around and really like to see it. But it's also bears the scars of the fighting here in the Second World War, doesn't it, as well? Just illustrating that fighting came back and that peace did not last very long. It's fascinating to stand there and see the chunks gouged out of it from fighting in the Second World War.
It is, and it's interesting. It has an interesting history, does the memorial, because it's got a brass panel on it, and that brass panel on the front with the rising sun and the wording has damage from bullet fire through the brass panelling. But if you look behind it, and you can see just behind the brass panelling, you realise that it didn't always have a brass panel on. So at some stage prior to the Second World War, this was added because originally the actual lettering was carved into the memorial itself. So it's gone through a period when it probably was looking a bit shabby, and they decided to add the brass panel to it. So again, it's a great link. And people say, why haven't they cast another panel? You could take off that brass panel, and within a few weeks you would have a brand new one looking spick and span. But of course, it's the history. It's a memorial in its own right to those men that fought and died around this memorial during the Second World War. So it's part of the history, and I love the fact that they've left that damage upon the memorial.
There's a couple of key sites on the Western Front where that's the case, and I'm talking from an Australian perspective here. I know there's many from the British perspective as well, but in particular, the Australian National Memorial at Villers-Bretonneux in France has a lot of damage on it from the Second World War, which, as they explain on a plaque on the side, they decided to leave as a testament to the men who fought there in the Second World War. Also at Pozières, at the Tank Memorial, across from the Australian Memorial at the windmill site, there is the memorial to tanks, used for the first time in battle in 1916, and a couple of the tanks have bullet damage on them. There's still a bullet wedged in one of the tanks. We'll talk about that when we do our Pozières walk, but it's. I think I agree with you entirely. The fact, the First and Second World Wars are really separate chapters of the same story, and the fact that the Germans were back here only 20 years after the First World War ended is a story that should be told. And I think that by leaving these damaged sites, they tell that story better than any plaque or any card in a museum possibly could.
I think it's a story that perhaps we'll tell in another podcast, the story of the fighting around Hill 60 and the fighting to take Ypres when the Germans took Ypres in 1940. It's another story that we should tell.
Well, we're really nearing the end of the walk now, Pete. Is there anything in additional you want to add to about Hill 60?
Well, there's just a comical story, and it's well worth repeating because everybody points it out. And as we're just about to leave, on the right-hand side, we can see a ball, a steel ball, in the bottom of one of the craters. And I always have a little bet with myself as to who is going to ask me, because I know somebody will. Somebody will say, "Pete, what is that down there?" And I always try and judge my clients and figure out which one is going to ask. And then we have a little guessing competition of what it might be. And there's always somebody there that will get it because somebody will know a broader aspect of history. Because oddly, it's a sea mine. And so I generally make the joke at this point and saying, do you think the tide comes up this far? And the answer obviously is not. So what is a sea mine doing at the bottom of one of the craters on Hill 60? And it's because there used to be a museum. Up until the 80s, I think, there was a museum called the Hill 60 Museum. We're going to walk past it as we head back to our transport. And that little museum, when it closed, all of the artifacts were sold to various other museums and private people, but nobody wanted a rusty old sea mine. So it was just rolled over the edge and rolled into the Hill 60 site, and there it remains, slowly rotting away. At one time, it was in such a good condition that you could move it about, and every time I turned up, it had been moved to a different shell hole and pushed around. Sadly, now it's collapsed, and it just sits in the one location. So it's always well worth having a quick look at and having a chat about. First World War sea mine.
That was always a bit of a guessing game as to where the mine would be on Hill 60. Sometimes it was in a crater near the front entrance, sometimes it was in the main one. I don't know whether it was teenagers coming out just rolling it around for a bit of fun, but it roamed all over Hill 60 in previous years. Well, Pete, it's been fascinating, like always. It's been really great. It's really, I've got to say to everyone listening to this, it's really interesting from my point of view because I think I know these sites well. I get paid to lead tours. People like what I've got to say when I walk this ground. Yet when I do these podcasts with you, Pete, my breadth of knowledge is minuscule compared to what you know. So I love doing this, and this is why you're our most popular guide on the Western Front, Pete. It's because you just know this stuff so well. And so I hope everyone listening is getting a real thrill out of this because I certainly am as well. I'm just really loving this. And one day soon, mate, we'll be able to roam the battlefields together again, hopefully leading a tour of hardy individuals who want to come with us. I just can't wait to get back over there and walk these sites for real.
No, I'm with you there, Matt. I just can't wait to get back to some of these sites that we're talking about. Yeah.
Well, Pete, we've got some exciting episodes of BattleWalks coming up. Thank you very much for listening in. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have, please, like always, leave some feedback for us on Facebook or on Twitter, especially on Apple Podcasts. If you can click the 5 stars, if you would be so kind and give us a nice review there, that helps more people find the podcast. Pete, thank you for your empathy, for your compassion, for your immense knowledge. It's wonderful to have you walking these sites in a virtual form and hopefully not too far away from walking them for real. But just thank you so much for joining us on BattleWalks.
Pleasure, Matt. Looking forward to the next one.
Balancing a wellness routine and busy travel plans? Try Alo Moves, the health and wellness app you need to stay consistent. Join alomoves.com with code ACAST for a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership. From yoga and Pilates to strength workouts, Alo Moves has it all. From 5 to 60 minutes, Allo Moves has classes or flow that fit your schedule. Plus, Allo Moves offers meditations, sound baths, nutrition tips, and self-care tutorials. Find your perfect wellness routine anytime and anywhere with Allo Moves.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.